The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here as always with John Cuna. How's it going, Johnny?
Going pretty well.
Nice.
Yeah,
nice.
I'm in a good mood today.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be discussing Evander Kane and gambling. So I think most people may have at least come across this news, but if not, we'll just give you a quick rundown. So basically, Evander Kane is a NHL player. He's been super successful, very good at what he does, very good as a hockey player. He's made, I think, just short of $56 million in career earnings, so made a lot of money. Yep. He still has a contract, I think, with 4 or 5 more years on it, making somewhere between $7 and $9 million a year.
Yep.
And somehow he is, I want to say about almost $27 million in debt. Pretty hard to do, okay, unless there's a gambling problem. And I think gambling is something that we haven't talked about on this podcast yet. And I think it's actually kind of along with porn, is a bit of a blind spot in our field sometimes. I don't think clinicians always screen for these types of things, particularly amongst guys. And I think both these issues have become more and more relevant over the last few years, which we're going to get into a little bit. So the main premise is that, Evander Kane is someone who clearly, through gambling in casinos mainly, has racked up this massive debt. I mean, I think he filed, so he's just shy of owing $27 million. He has filed for Chapter 11, I think, bankruptcy. Some of his assets, his homes have been seized. I don't know if he got a divorce or if he's in the process of it, but I think his wife or ex-wife is now accusing him of betting on hockey games, which is a whole different level of that. Now, he denies it, but one of the problems with believing someone with a gambling issue is that gambling and any addiction brings with it a lot of self-deceit, and when you're predominantly deceiving yourself, you are going to lie to everybody else. That is just what goes with the territory until a person gets help. So it's very hard to take someone in Evander Kane's position at their word on anything, right?
Right.
The spouse or ex-spouse does not really have an incentive to lie, I don't think, compared to someone like him who does. Doesn't mean she's telling the truth or he's lying, but it's tough. It's tough to believe him. So I think there's an investigation going on around whether he did bet on hockey games. And so far, I don't know. I think they're doing a very thorough investigation of that. It's tough to even know, right? Because he could have been doing it, or more likely, he hired what's called a beard, which is someone to place bets for you. And that's hard to track unless someone sort of speaks up and lets people know what was going on, that they were that person, that they knew who was, or that kind of thing. So it just brings up an interesting topic. We want to talk about gambling. I want to get into a little bit about why gambling is addictive. I think the example I give for people, and this is why social media is addictive, it's not the winning or the losing that makes it addictive, right? It's that, if anyone's ever seen roulette table or played roulette, I know you have the key. If anyone's listening, don't worry about this. We're joking, by the way, but don't worry about this if you want to play roulette by Johnny's rules, because you'll always win.
Always.
Just bet on double green.
That's the only one you have to do. So it's the only number that counts.
Exactly. But when people are, all jokes aside, when people are gambling, roulette is a good example of what happens, because when the ball is rolling around, that's actually when all the dopamine is being released, right? Yeah. And as opposed to like serotonin or other other hormones that are released in the body or the brain, dopamine is the drug of it's the hormone of more, right? Serotonin, I think some other ones, like when it's released and it causes sort of pleasurable or good
endorphins are another ones,
good reactions in the body or in the mind or both. There isn't the tendency or the need to come back and get more. It's just, it was good and then you move on, or that's the way the body reacts to it. With dopamine, it's not like that. That was good. how do I get that back, right? And it leads to this dependency on it to go seek more. And then you develop a tolerance for that, like any other addictive thing.
Yep.
And then you need to get more to create the same effect.
Yeah, try eating a single M&M. Right, and see how that goes.
Exactly.
Kind of the same thing, right? You get a little taste, and you're like, "Ooh, that was great." Keep going, and then the bag is gone. Or for me, try to eat just a single Oreo and see how that goes.
Sugar cookies,
right? Same thing, right? It's just like it's just not happening. It's going to keep going and going and going.
No, that's why I just don't buy sugar cookies because I can't have them around the house because that tub is going to be gone in 2 days, maybe one day. Yeah. So that's a whole other topic for a different episode, I'm sure. Our past with binge eating issues.
Yep.
Not really. We're joking, but probably shouldn't make light of that. So with Evander Kane, though, like, look, if when you're gambling, there is that dopamine release when that ball is rolling around, and you have to understand what that does to you at a neurological level. Like, it is hooking you in. It's making you need more. And when people get too into that, they're not considering anything else. They're not considering winning or losing. They're not considering whether they're blowing millions and millions of dollars and racking up debt or possibly going to get their assets seized. They are just a slave to that need for dopamine. And that's why it's so, so dangerous. And I think, I think porn is probably pretty similar, right? In terms of the reaction of the brain that happens when using that kind of thing on multiple levels. But again, it's the search. Online porn. So I want to kick it to you on this. You know, why do we think porn and gambling are somewhat synonymous in this sense? Or why do you think they're both problematic in your opinion?
So I would say that they're both similar in the sense that you were just talking about, like the dopamine release. Porn as like a topic, I would say, is not discussed enough. It's like the hidden epidemic of itself going on, especially for I won't even say especially for young guys, because I think it's a problem for everybody. But I think, to your point, I think it's easy to gambling is more easy to access to. Porn is like a type into a web browser at this point, and find whatever you want. You can, for parents, I have these conversations all the time of like, hey, I found something kind of suspicious on the search engine. Those are for the savvy parents who actually know how to search history. And they'll put up blocks or things like that, but you can always access it. And we'll get into sort of like how gambling is shifting in the future and what that might do. We'll talk about that in a second. But for porn especially, I've stopped asking if you watch porn, and I ask how much porn do you watch.
Yep.
I don't because
you'll get a no.
I'll get the no, and I know they probably are watching porn. And I'll ask. Adolescents. I'm not asking high schoolers if they're watching porn. I'm asking kids who are in like late middle school, early high school, if they're, like how much porn are you consuming? And I think for a multitude of reasons. I think for the dopamine piece, yes, it's definitely problematic and it's easy to access, and it develops that pattern of like, I want it. Completely derails the image of like what actual intimacy is supposed to look like between two people on like a romantic level. And I think it desensitizes people to what sex is supposed to look like versus what it looks like on a computer screen. It's very different. So I think there's a lot of different issues with that. And I think it's created a lot of problems in relationships. Both either a person's watching too much porn, the other person is upset by that. So, some people consider that to be cheating if you're watching too much porn, or those types of things, which causes intimacy issues within the actual relationship. So there's whole lots of different things. And if you're starting to have the conversation with people when they're in their like early adulthood, 18 plus, you've missed years of them practicing probably in a maladaptive way. And I think so that's why I've shifted even in my own practice in the last few years. Like, it used to be part of the screening process of like, hey, do you watch pornography online? And to your point, the answer was like, no, right? Especially for the younger guys, like, no, absolutely not. And you knew that they were, but now it's just, I've shifted the language of just like, how much do you watch? Like, how frequently or how consistent are you watching porn? Yeah,
it's a great point. And I tend to do the same thing with gambling. I usually go into fantasy sports. Yeah. So I'll start with sports watching, what sports they play and watch. And then I'll get into fantasy sports because that's a bit of a bridge, right? Usually there's some money on that. I don't really consider that gambling. If it's like a one-time, paying $10 to enter a league, you're paying $50, it's a one-time thing. But some people would say that that's not accurate, and that maybe I'm biased and underselling it. Could be true. And then you have gambling on sports is kind of the next level, right? So I think talking about fantasy sports is very much a natural segue to fantasy sports is great. How much your leagues cost? What other times have you bet on sports kind of separately on these play? And then they'll just get into it, because I think that happens actually a lot more now than we think too. This actually makes me realize that in terms of pornography, we probably have to have our own episode,
a whole episode on it. Yeah.
Because I have some interesting thoughts on that. I think I want to do a deep dive on some data, because I know in the past, it was much more of a male issue, right? Females, and this is painting with a huge brush, doesn't even factor in gender fluidity and that kind of stuff. But in terms of like just from a binary perspective, so like males much more likely to watch porn and seek that out. Women less likely to watch porn, more likely to seek out graphic novels. Believe it or not, that's actually how they would seek pleasure when they're by themselves, is through that means of reading a story. It just shows you how people are programmed differently in terms of what drives them in that sense.
Yeah, I'd be curious if that was like stigma related too. Like,
it could be.
Like reading books is more acceptable to access pornography than it would be to like search on a website and watch like porn online. So I don't know. I'm curious to learn more about that.
There was a book that went into this in great detail called The Porn Trap. But again, this was written 2010-ish, I think. And so a lot has changed in the last 10, 11 years. And I don't know that I would guess, especially that porn use, especially amongst young girls, has actually increased a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is. It might be because they feel pressure because the guys their age are also watching it, or it's such a common thing to talk about and see that they might feel like they have. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. We should look into that, because I think it would make for an interesting episode to try to figure out what is going on, how things have shifted in the last 5-10 years, why it's a massive problem across the board, that kind of thing.
Yep. Lisa Lang at CNN did a really fascinating like a little short I wouldn't even necessarily call it a documentary. It was kind of like a short clip or a short series on that. So I'd encourage some people to check that out. That was released, I think, within the last two years, maybe. I can't remember if it was pre or post pandemic. It's just the way my brain works now. But it was really fascinating, and she talked about it a lot of like, this is an epidemic that people aren't talking enough about. So I think we should dedicate an entire time to talk about it.
So we know both those issues, gambling and porn, are definitely massive issues for guys in particular, but we're going to get into a little bit more of like maybe in that next episode of if it's also if it impacts people. I mean, it impacts people outside of just guys, because if guys are having issues with it, then it impacts most of the people in their life, if not just the intimate partner they may have.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about why gambling. So there's been a lot of information lately about gambling being legalized, right?
Yeah.
Sports betting in particular. There are platforms now that you can use to legally gamble on sports. Usually it's state specific, I think. So like
FanDuel, places like that.
Yep. So you can do it within New Hampshire borders, I think. Is it legal in Massachusetts yet?
It's a good question. I'm not sure.
I don't think it is, but it's going to be. I think so. The movement is sort of like cannabis, where it's like it's eventually going to be legal everywhere. It seems like that's where it's trending across the board with cannabis and with gambling.
Yeah. Too much money to be had.
Exactly. It's a sort of untapped market, excuse me. And I think when it comes to lucrative untapped market, it's only a matter of time before the powers that be legalize that to tap it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm kind of curious to hear like what your thoughts are with that inevitability of it becoming legal. Like, what do you see as those issues moving forward? Like, what do you see as going to be the problematic places that we should be paying attention to?
It's a good point. It's a good question. I would say, so we have talked in the past about like financial freedom, and about how now one of the great things about social media and the internet, things like that, is that I think information about easy to access, easy to understand information about financial freedom has become more available to people.
Right.
Which I think is really key. And I think people who are younger now have access to information about the credit score system and about how to become financially free, about return on investment, compound interest, growing your financial base so that you're financially
multiple
free.
Revenue streams.
That information is much more accessible now. It doesn't mean everyone accesses it, but certainly a lot more people, I think, now than in our generation, let alone the one before us, right? Our parents' generation, where like credit cards were kind of new and like there's just plastic and right. We've talked a lot about that. I mean, I feel like gambling becoming legal is actually going to neutralize that benefit, because people are going to, if you give people access to a potential dopamine rush we talk about stuff through the lens of sports. So through the lens of sports, right? Because they'll be gambling on sports, which is an activity they love to watch. I don't even know if we know the catastrophic impact that's going to have on, particularly on young guys. I think I think their ability to enjoy sports is going to be diminished. I think their mental health is going to be impacted. I think their relationships will be impacted in a very negative way. And their ability to achieve financial freedom will definitely be impacted because they will go for the quick fix, short win. And guess what, guys? Like, if you think that system is set up to let you win tons of money, you're lying to yourself, right? These people that set the odds makers and casinos and these platforms, Vegas, there's a reason they're going to be huge, massive businesses. And it's not because you're going to beat them. Like, that's just not what it's going to be. So if you want to think that you're going to, you're deluding yourself. And so I would just caution people because that's what's going to happen. A lot of people are going to lose their shirt. There's not enough checks and balances in place to prevent that from happening, in my opinion. I'd have to look into it more in terms of what these platforms do, other than just give a 30-second verbal thing at the beginning when you sign up. Like, if you have a gambling problem, call this number. Like, give me a break. That's a cover your ass kind of thing that they do just so they don't get sued by somebody. But it's not like actually if they really care, they wouldn't even set this thing up, right? If we're being honest. So I think financial freedom of younger generations is going to be drastically impacted. Work ethic is going to be impacted, right? I think people are susceptible to falling for the lie that is like the quick rise to being rich or that kind of thing, right? Yeah. They don't want to put in the work. They often don't want to put in the work. And even when they start doing that, if they're presented with some quick fix path to that, they're going to possibly take it, and it's going to ruin the actual organic, hard work driven path that's going to get them there. This is going to cut that out because we know that, like, if you're trying to achieve financial freedom, you have to let compound interest work for you, which means you have to get started early, and you have to have ways of kind of bringing in that income, and work ethic is what's going to do it. If you're gambling that money away, it's the opposite of compound interest, right? You're taking all the foundation of what would be your financial freedom, and you're just wiping out with a bulldozer. Essentially, that's what's going to happen. Yeah. So that's the second one. Relationships, definitely. I said that before, but anytime someone has an addiction issue and or financial problems, those two things are massive problems for relationships. It's very hard, particularly marriages or intimate relationships. It's very hard for that stuff to be sustained if you have these types of problems. So there's going to be a ripple effect of that. And then I don't know if it's going to have an impact on the economy. I mean, I think maybe it's equalized out. I mean, some of these companies will be making tons of money, which I guess adds jobs and adds, tax revenue and things like that. But then you have other people that would have been having higher incomes personally, and then that they would be contributing more by spending more money and by earning their own money and paying taxes that they're not going to be. So I don't know. I'm not an economist. I don't know the impact of this, whether it's a net negative, a net wash, or a net negative, or what. But I would have to think it's going to have some impact on missed work days and spending because their money is going all into this. I don't know. So those are my thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen examples of when people are given access to things that make them feel really good and what that happens, right? Like we're well past the point of like the opioid crisis of what happened when we gave people painkillers, not really knowing the total income. And well, actually now they did sort of know what they were doing. And I think that plays in the back of my head, like giving people access to something that's going to, like you, to your point, like give that immediate dopamine rush.
Agreed.
We've seen this play out before, not in the same realm, but we've seen a similar method of how this works. And I think maybe this is just the cynic in me talking, but I think it's proven to be a lucrative move for big companies to do this, knowing the outcomes of what they can do with not really considering the user, right? Yeah. And that was a term that now I think about more often when the user, yes. Right? From that Netflix documentary of like the two people that talk about users are drug addict, people who are selling like drugs to people illegally, and then people who are on like social media, big tech talk about like users. And I think of this as like the same type of move, of trying to create users. Yeah. And I guess I'm cynical about this. I am mostly optimistic about most things and try to find the positive reframe in most things, but this one feels like a really dangerous slippery slope if things aren't done in an appropriate way. And I think we're seeing history repeat itself because I think some of the people in positions of power know that this is going to be a potential lucrative move for them and not really concerned about what the users are going to be or the cost of what that will look like.
Yeah, so, agreed. So it's interesting. I think it will be an ongoing discussion. I'm sure we'll probably have a second part about this topic.
Yeah.
Because it's very nuanced, and particularly about Evander Kane. It's hard to know right now. We try not to speculate, right? So I think this is clear. We're going based off him filing for bankruptcy, it being common knowledge that he has gambled at casinos and not paid debts. I think he owes $1.5 million to some casino in Vegas, and his total debts are about 27. That's public information. But in terms of what's going on now, in terms of him potentially gambling on hockey, we don't know that. And
right.
I think I'll caution people to jump to that conclusion until the investigation of the NHL is complete, and then we'll know more information at that time.
Yep.
But it's interesting, and I do worry that it's going to be a massive issue over the next 10 years, particularly. So it's something we'll definitely revisit at some point.
Yeah.
So that's it for today. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. As always, please check us out on YouTube and hit subscribe. We're trying to get that number up. We want to get feedback from people. That's the most important thing. More important than subscriber numbers, we just want feedback. Give us some comments. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know if you have any questions or suggestions about topics that we might be able to cover. We always appreciate that. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about Evander Kane and gambling. And we'll be back next week.
Thanks, everyone.